What's a four-letter word for fast, powerful mixing? Intriguing. Tell me more, Gregory Scott of Kush After Hours. Welcome to After Hours. My name is Gregory Scott. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about mixing in mono. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not talking about making your song mono or your production mono. I'm talking about taking a stereo mix, collapsing it to mono while you're listening to it, and adjusting the balances and the equalization and the compression and whatever else you want to do in mono. Now, there are a lot of reasons why I'm a huge fan of mixing in mono. But the reason I think you should take on this challenge of learning to mix in mono, and specifically learning to hear music in mono, which we're going to get to that in a minute. But mixing in mono, in my experience, makes incredibly fast and easy work out of two of the things that I historically had the most trouble with, especially early on in my mixing career. And that would be cleaning up masking and balancing the lead vocal. Now, masking, real quick, if you don't know what masking is just a fancy word for frequency pileup that sucks. So if you have a bass and then you have a piano, and the piano player is playing all the chords down in the second octave, so they're real muddy and dark. And then there's an acoustic guitar, and the acoustic guitar is strumming deep stuff. And there's other there's a synth pad, and it's real low. And the point is, you know what I'm talking about here. All these sounds are warm and thick, but when you add them all together and you try to mix them, there's just this huge mess of frequencies that are piling up. That's called masking. Cleaning up masking, one of our main jobs, one of the hardest things to figure out. What I love about mono is that it takes away the little things that we can do to fool ourselves into thinking, I don't have a problem. My mix is sounding clear because I took this muddy acoustic guitar and this muddy piano track and I panned them like this. And they're like, oh, look, I can hear through them. So I've done my job. It's great. The problem with that is that you actually don't have the space in the mix that you think you do. You do have more space when they're like this than when they're like this, but you don't have as much as you could. So as soon as you start putting other sounds in, there's going to be conflicts and there's going to be further masking problems because you have smaller and smaller margins of error as you're adding these sounds in. And you can and should use panning to help clear up those kinds of things. But it's really, really good to know exactly what's going on in the entirety of the mix. And what's beautiful about mono is that you can break the advice that so many people give you on the internet, which is to never do things in solo. And I'm not talking about solo, but I'm talking about solo the kick and the bass and the piano. And listen to them in mono. And you'll hear like, oh, okay, well, there's too much 200 hertz coming from that bass, and there's too much 500 hertz coming from the kick drum. So let me carve those out a little bit. And because they're piled up on top of each other, you hear the maximum possible conflict there. And if you clear that up so that they sound nice and friendly with one another in mono, and you do that with all of your sources as you're mixing in mono, and it takes a while to do that. I spend most of my time mixing in mono. But what's beautiful is that when you uncheck the mono button on your plugin, or you uncheck the button on your monitor controller, however you're getting to mono, and you switch back to stereo, everything opens up in a way that before you switched to mono and did that kind of cleanup, it just wasn't happening. And so mono is such an amazing tool to clean up and clear up and open up spaces in stereo mixes. That would be reason A, why I strongly suggest you get to know it. Reason B is that the sources that are supposed to be center or mono in the mix, they're going to be louder when you monitor the whole mix in mono. And there's a physical, acoustical, electrical reason for that, and it has to do with panning and has to do with energy. So think about this. Take a source like a vocal. And the vocal is generally going to be up the middle if it's a lead vocal. Think about what's happening there is you've got it's a mono sound, but it's coming out of both speakers. That means you've got a vocal and a vocal. Now, they're exactly the same. There's no difference between these two channels of information, so you will perceive it in what's known as the phantom center. you'll perceive that as being mono up the middle. But make no mistake, you're hearing it here because there's two of them coming here and here equally and evenly. Going somewhere with this, trust me. You got your vocal, which is really two vocals. You got your kick, which is really two kicks. You got your bass, bass, snare. But say you have an acoustic guitar that was panned off to the side, and you have a piano which was panned off to this side. There's only one of those, right? So when you hit mono, you've got two kicks, two basses, two snares, two vocals, one acoustic guitar, one piano. What happens? The piano and the acoustic guitar in mono, they get quieter, usually by 3.5 or 3 dB, depending on what's called the pan law in your DAW. When you have a sound, and you know this, when you turn the fader down by 3 dB in a mix, that's a significant amount. It will be a lot quieter. The beautiful thing about mono is you can leverage that now, because if you click to mono and your kick, snare, bass, and especially your vocal aren't the loudest things in the mix by a decent margin, you've probably got a balance issue in your mix. And for me, especially with vocals, that is such good information to have. So what I will do is I will, pretty early on in a mix, I'll get the stereo rough happening. I'll get things, sounds feeling pretty good. I'll spend a half hour, get my sounds together, whatever. And then I'm hitting the mono button, and I'm switching over to the NS10s usually. And then I am turning the whole thing down, taking my volume knob, turning it down almost to the threshold of audibility, meaning my mix is now so quiet that if somebody were to come into the room and go, "Hey, Greg, can I ask you a favor?" I'd be like, "Shh, I can't hear my mix. It's so quiet." If the conversation in the room would drown it out. And at that volume, if I can't track every single word, and if I can't hear every single snare hit and every single kick drum hit, then I know what my work is. I know I need to ride the vocal in those moments when I can't hear it, or I need to work something else that's getting in the way of the vocal just for those things, or maybe a little bit of both. And for the snare, I like my snare to be the loudest thing, but not the loudest thing. I want it to be the most forward, which I will use the fader and the EQ and the compressor for that. And what I want to hear is I want my vocal here, nice and loud and proud. And then the snare to be like pop, pop, pop. That's how I want my mono presentation to be. And so the first thing I'll do is I will turn the fader on the snare up until it's doing that. It's clearly in front of the vocal with every hit. And then one of two things you're going to find is going to happen. If you turn it up with the fader, it's either going to just feel right, or it's going to feel like the snare is now just too loud. You've put it in front of the vocal and it's swallowing the vocal a little bit, or it's annoying you, in which case your snare is not bright enough. And so you turn it back down with a fader, get that thing just kind of sitting right under the vocal, or get it whooping away a little bit behind the vocal. And then you got to find the clarity or the presence frequencies on the snare. So sometimes it's 4K, sometimes it's 6 or 8K. Sometimes you got to open up the attack on the compressor to let more of the snap of the snare through. Sometimes you need more distortion, or you need to add a parallel distortion track and grind up some good white noise crunch on that thing and blend that in. Or sometimes you got to do all of the above, but do whatever you need to do. Get that white noise popping in front of the vocal, because that's the groove. And if you get just the white noise of the snare in front of the vocal will always stay clear and intelligible. But the snare can help to really define that groove in a modern and cool way. So in mono, that snare, the high frequencies of the snare for me are always the loudest thing in the mix. Close second is the vocal. Then the kick. You have to work on the kick articulation, because at quiet volume, especially on small speakers like the NS10, but even on your regular speakers, at a quiet volume, if you're like, there's not enough, let's back this up. At a loud volume, if there's not enough kick, you're tempted to turn the fader up, or maybe you're tempted to grab that 40 hertz knob and be like, yeah, now I'm feeling that kick. But you can't in mono at quiet volumes on small speakers. You turn up 40 hertz till the cows come home. That's what the kids say, right? The cows coming home. It's just not going to do you any good. You've got to find other ways to make the kick not louder, but more audible. And that usually involves, again, the mid-range, and the presence frequencies, which for kick drum could be anything from 400 or 500 hertz, if you wanted a little bit kind of old school papery knocky, right on up to like 1.2, 1.5K, maybe even 2K. Crank that thing if you're doing like some fast metal or whatever. You got to make that clicky. And then the last, the bass, man, at quiet volumes, getting your bass to just like every note, boom, 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 boom. You just want that pluck in your eardrum. You got to tune the compression. You got to make sure you got enough 200 hertz, or 500 hertz, or 800 hertz in that bass. Mono at quiet, you got to get the articulation frequencies to get the most critical things in your mix singing in the mid-range meaningfully and clearly. And what happens is if you do that, and then you turn the other sources that you know are panned, you turn those up to the point where they're starting to encroach. Like, okay, now this guitar is starting to feel like it's loud. And then back it off just a little bit. Get it back out of the way. So you're like, that guitar kind of sounds a little too quiet. That's where you want it in mono. If it's panned off to the side, that's where you want it to be in mono. And if you do this with your mix, you get that white noise of the snare up front, the vocal right behind it. The kick and the bass are audible and clear even at quiet volumes. And everything else that's living in the mix, it's in its own space. It's clear, but it's clearly in the background. When you switch back to stereo, you're gonna reach out through YouTube and you're gonna hug me, is what you're gonna do, because that mix that you thought was pretty good, that you thought was pretty clear, that you thought was pretty wide, all the space opens up. You're like, oh God. So weirdly and ironically, mono is a stereo mix's best friend. I use it all the time. I spend probably 80% of my time mixing in mono, except for the very beginning and the very end. And I love doing it on small speakers like NS10s, but even if you don't have NS10s, put a mono plugin on your mix bus and get to work.